Hello everybody, my name is Ratnos and today I'm making another WoW theory video. This one is about different kinds of damage. You'll often see people linking damage meters or Warcraft logs when in actuality there's a lot of different characteristics of damage that don't necessarily show up there or sometimes show up there that really affect how valuable that damage is to your group's chance of success and are really useful in describing the sorts of damage that you're seeing as well. And these are factors where if you can understand them, you can start to understand which ones are generally more desirable than others. That can really help you make good calls about how to build your character, which characters to play on a certain raid fight, for instance, and just in general to get a good idea of what class balance sort of fundamentals will favor in any given patch. So let's start off with kind of one of the easier distinctions between types of damage, which is burst damage versus sustained damage. Obviously, this one I think a lot of people would pretty easily understand. Burst damage is something like Fire or Arcane Mage. So for instance, here is the top Fire Mage parse at this time on Guardian of the First Ones, right? And you can see this is just what the damage is looking like, right? Very high peaks, and then long periods of pretty low damage, right? Doing basically 0 DPS at this point. Here's probably a small combustion or something. And again, lots of low damage, and then bigger peaks with your cooldowns. Arcane Mage, pretty similar pattern, right? You got big damage, you got a little smaller cooldown window, big damage, etc. all the way through. Compare this pattern to Frost Mage. So here's the top Frost Mage parse on Guardian, and you can instead see very high sustained damage the whole way through, right? The entire fight. You can barely see where even cooldowns are necessarily being popped. The one thing you can determine is like the person probably is doing a mechanic right here, right? But other than that, they're just kind of blasting the whole way through, right? You can see, I guess, where the frozen orbs are, and you can see the damage goes up a little bit where we have these little, little veins of frozen orb damage coming in there. I mean veins in the orb prospecting sense here, not in the icy vein sense. But yeah, definitely a very different type of damage that is being delivered here. So people often understand this distinction, but they don't often understand why it is that burst is inherently generally more favorable than sustain. And it almost always is. In most fights, you will find burst damage to either be as good or better than sustain damage. Assuming you're doing the same overall DPS, you would rather be doing it in a more bursty fashion. Because as long as you can make this burst window work out well for you, right? As long as you can find a way to plant for 25 seconds, you're pretty good here. If you have to go and ice block during this area, whatever, you have to go and do a mechanic. If you get targeted by a mechanic during this area, whatever, that's fine. Now the flip side of this is, okay, well, what if you get targeted by, a really tough mechanical overlap during your cooldowns? Well, that could be really bad. But in general, being bursty is a good characteristic for your damage, because it gives you that extra flexibility with the rest of your time. And on several bosses, there are important burst windows, right? You try to get your damage done in those windows as much as possible, and these sorts of profiles for damage tend to be a lot better. All right, next sort of axis of damage that we'll consider is area of effect versus single target damage. And a lot of people sort of perceive this as being on one axis, right? They'll think about this as being, oh, well, you're either doing AoE damage or you're doing single target damage, right? And so, they'll think about specs as either being good at single target or being good at AoE. But I actually think there's a really other important axis to be considering with AoE to single target damage, and that is funnel. Funnel is a very important characteristic for damage, not funnel. So this is something that you'll hear talked about a lot, and a lot of people don't really understand what funnel means. Funneling is the characteristic of, oh, hey, there's 5 targets around here. How much damage am I doing to a single target? So for instance, if you're playing a subtlety rogue, right, and you're on single target, let's just say that this point right here would represent just doing your normal single target damage to the primary target, right? A subtlety rogue, when you're fighting 5 targets, right, and they're doing Shuriken Storm Eviscerate, they're doing substantially more damage to that single target than they would be if they were doing just a single target rotation against one target, right? The addition of extra mobs means that they are moving up on this funnel axis. And I would probably describe that spec as, operating somewhere over here if they're doing that rotation, right? Or maybe even up in this area, right? If they're doing that. Yellow doesn't really show up very well in this, but if they're doing that sort of rotation, right, is that they're doing a lot of single target damage. It's heavily funnel oriented. And that means they're not doing as much damage to the other targets in the pack. Whereas by contrast, there are some specs that will, so let's consider another type of damage, right? Consider something like a split damage effect, right? Something like Fey Transfusion from Night Fey Shaman. This is an effect where actually you're dealing the exact same amount of damage as more targets get involved here, but it is being split among all targets, right? So you're actually doing less damage to your primary target than you would if there weren't enemies surrounding it. And then there are sort of neutral effects, right, where it's just like, oh, I'm going to be doing roughly the same damage to a single target as I would if I was doing my single target rotation to it. And in general, a very valuable type of damage is this funnel damage. This is something that Subtlety Rogues, Frost Mages, Affliction Warlocks, at some points in the past, kind of Shadow Priests, although they've really just kind of been like good cleave damage and not particularly funnily or not funnily. This expansion, they're pretty much just single target monsters. But in the past, in previous versions of that spec, they've been kind of all over the place on this graph. In general, though, there are frequently fights or situations where funnel is an extremely prized characteristic of damage. So definitely something to think about is, when there are more targets around my primary target, am I dealing more damage to that primary target than I would if I was just doing a single target rotation to it? Okay. Another characteristic of damage is mobile versus immobile damage, right? So can you do this rotation on the move, right? Can you, say a Beast Mastery Hunter, your fully mobile rotation, that can be very valuable in some fights, in some Mythic Plus situations, where you just don't lose any damage as a result of moving. Other specs, the movement's a little bit more skill intensive, right? You have some amount of movement globals on instant casts that you can do your movement during those globals, and as long as you can do that, you're not going to lose any damage. But you have parts of rotation that do not have that characteristic where you will lose damage. And another kind of concept that joins this is the concept of whether or not your rotation is punishing or forgiving, right? Whether or not if you miss one global, how much of your damage are you missing? So say you're doing 10 globals in a 10-second window, just to simplify this, right? And you miss one global. How much does your DPS drop? Does it drop by, say, 10%? That's kind of in the middle, right? You've lost 10% of your globals, and you do 10% less damage in this time frame. That would be true for something like Frost Mage, right? If you take Frost Mage and you cut out, actually they even lose, they're a little bit more towards the punishing side because they then lose cooldown recovery effects. So that would mean they would actually probably lose more than 10% of their damage if you took away 10% of their globals, right? Other specs that are like dot focused, this tends to be less the case, right? If you take an Affliction Warlock and they have their dots out and you turn one of their Shadow Bolts into, they're forced to run during that, they don't really care, right? As long as that one global that you take isn't one where they needed to be applying a dot, but their dots are instant cast, right? So it's a lot harder to be screwed off of those globals than it is to be screwed off of the Shadow Bolt globals, right? And similarly for specs like Assassination Rogue, one of the reasons the Assassination Rogue is often better than you would expect on particularly end bosses that are highly mechanically intense is that this is very true for them. Assassination Rogues are very forgiving DPS-wise, where if you take one of their Mutilate globals away, they're like, okay, I was maybe even going to just be waiting during this global anyways to build up energy, so all I lost is, if I had to be away from the boss for a couple seconds here, is a couple auto attacks, right? It's nothing big. You take a Subtlety Rogue, by contrast, and you hit one of their globals, it's much more likely that it's going to be problematic, especially if it's one of the ones during any of their cooldowns, right? It is very bad news for that spec. So that's kind of this axis, the way you can think about it, right? Is if you take away this global, does it have more or less than the fraction of time, that you lose away from being on the boss of an impact on your DPS? And then finally, another characteristic of damage that is worth considering is execute. Execute damage, here's a Fury Warrior log from Guardian to visualize this, right? You can see, just look how high the sustain portion and the peaks are during this execute phase versus during the non-execute phase, right? We're looking at something that is, an extra 50% taller or 30% taller here, and maybe twice as high during the sustained portion of the DPS here. Very valuable type of damage. This is another thing where it's almost always the case that execute damage is better than non-execute damage, because in most boss fights, particularly most important boss fights, you don't care as much about early damage, and you care more about the execute phase damage. On a fight like Guardian, the first ones, this is not really true, right? Guardian, there's no phases or anything like that. You're just doing any damage to the boss at any time is equally valuable. On a fight like Sire Denathrius, this is not true. On a fight like Sire Denathrius, execute damage is way more important, especially than phase 1 damage, because you stop DPS in phase 1, and then phase 3 is just as soon as you can kill the boss, you're good, right? And so the sooner you can do that, the better. On a fight like Sylvanas Windrunner, okay, well, it turns out the boss dies at 50%, so for that reason, oops, this execute would still be good. It would still be good to have damage that was done during the final 30% of that boss encounter. It just so happens that the final 30% of that boss encounter, she isn't in execute range because of where her health bar, just the weird nature of a fight that ends at 50 or 45% instead of 0. But that would be a fight where otherwise execute would be a good characteristic for damage, right? Doing more damage in phase 3 and less damage in phase 1 would be a fantastic trade-off on almost every end boss fight that has a phase 1, 2, and 3. That would almost always be the case. And so for that reason, specs that gain damage during execute, very valuable. Fire is kind of an interesting case here. Like here's again, Fire. They often play Searing Touch, right? Where they get a little bit more damage, but a lot more mobile during the execute phase. So absolutely something to think about, something to consider, depending on what the situation is. Anyways, I'm sure I've missed some characteristics of DPS, but these were the ones that jumped to mind. Hopefully this helps you, think about stuff. That's what this sort of, type of video that I've been doing a little bit of recently has been aimed to do. If you like this sort of video, I've made a couple others like it, like recently one on when to press your cooldowns. You might like that. It's on my channel. Check out my Twitch stream, twitch.tv/Dratnos. Thanks everybody for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.